But now we will pass to the next paper, and that's the paper presented by Marcos Moltz. And Marcos will present the paper, as mentioned before, on conceptualizing human rights cities, legal deliberation, and practical proposals on the pursuit of human rights and SDGs at local level. Marcos holds a doctoral degree in law and is a senior researcher at the International Center for the Promotion of Human Rights at the local and regional levels under the auspices of UNESCO in the human rights city of Graz, Austria. He's a legal expert of the Austrian National Focal Point for the Multidisciplinary Research Network of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, FRA, and regularly reports on the topical issues of the fundamental rights situation in Austria. Marcus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm really delighted to present you my paper on the integrated pursuit of human rights and the SDGs on the local level. Now, we all know that the 2030 Agenda introduced a development framework based on human rights, which is addressed to all government levels. And now cities around the world perceive this as an opportunity to implement the SDGs and human rights concurrently. This so-called integrated approach, however, is not a really straightforward task, in my opinion. And I will try to explain this in my presentation by way of three strands, so to say. First, I will point out the relevant commonalities, but also the differences between human rights and the SDGs from a more conceptual point of view. Secondly, I will analyze to what extent the progress towards the SDGs actually contributes to the enjoyment of human rights at the local level. And finally, I will try to give you some conclusions on the significance of SDGs in human rights cities. So what role should SDGs have in the concept of human rights cities? Let me start with the commonalities. Human rights and the development agenda share the principles of universality, indivisibility, equality, and non-discrimination. This is rather obvious, and Joyce already mentioned them in depth. Both agendas apply to all humans worldwide. All components of the agenda have to be pursued as a whole. And in respect to equality, it was important to point out that the leave no one behind imperative brought the development agenda closer to the human rights agenda. So I totally agree with Joyce in that respect. There are also a number of differences from a conceptual point of view. In terms of commitment, for example, we all know that human rights are legal obligations, but the development goals are more political commitments. Or when it comes to the time frame for the implementation, I think we should bear in mind that the SDGs have an end date by 2030, so to say. They will be replaced by new development goals, most likely. But by then, the human rights obligations will continue to exist. And one point I'd like to mention from this slide is the review process of the development agenda. This is clearly distinct from the judicial or quasi-judicial monitoring mechanisms established for human rights treaties. And of course, also the human rights indicators, they differ significantly from the indicators for the SDGs. We should recall that. But what about the mutual reinforcement now? Does progress towards the SDGs contribute to the enjoyment of human rights at the local level? In my paper, I approached this question from three perspectives. First, I analyzed the formal, but also the material linkages between human rights and SDGs. And then I analyzed the relevance of SDG indicators and targets for human rights policy, specifically for the local level. And finally, also briefly looked into some case studies on 3 human rights cities. And of course, I can only summarize the main results of this study today. The links between the SDGs and human rights seem to be very well known. indeed, the 2030 agenda makes references to human rights on several occasions and thereby establishes many of those formal connections. Moreover, a considerable number of SDGs converge with human rights standards also in terms of content. Now, I presented you some studies here which confirm this clearly, but also the Human Rights Treaty Body develop a practice at the moment where they also refer to SDGs and explain how they can be implemented together with human rights. Yet the answers are not that straightforward, in my opinion, when I analyzed the relevance of the SDG targets and indicators for human rights policy at the local level. Now, in my analysis, I found that the local level is hardly addressed by the SDG targets and indicators. Indeed, many SDG targets and indicators are completely unrelated to human rights as well. And finally, I found that there are indeed some significant convergences and overlaps between some of the SDG targets and indicators and human rights. And now comes the but. There are also many SDGs for which there are not any such overlaps or significant overlaps, in particular for those I mentioned here on the slide. Therefore, I also looked at the practice of human rights cities and tried to find out whether they share some sort of a common approach for such an integrated implementation of human rights and the SDGs at the local level. These case studies covered the human rights cities of Graz, the city where I'm from, York and Montevideo. And what I found essentially is that the 2030 agenda is not explicitly combined with the human rights city process there, something that was also just mentioned by Joyce in relation to Guangzhou, I think. These cities do not establish some explicit linkages, but they remain just implicit. Such a truly integrated approach comprising human rights and all relevant aspects of the SDGs, this is something that is still developing, apparently. So what do we learn from this results of my analysis for the conceptualization of human rights cities? We all know that human rights cities still often apply a rather pragmatic approach and develop their human rights city identity based on the local human rights needs. But from a conceptual point of view, what roles should the SDGs then have in the human rights city concept? I think we can draw 5 lessons from this. Lesson 1 is an integrated implementation is possible in principle. Now, given the plethora of formal and material linkages between human rights and SDGs, the implementation of the development agenda at the local level may indeed foster the realization of human rights and vice versa. As Joyce just mentioned the example of Guangzhou, which was very interesting, by the way. Lesson 2, practical experience is still lacking. I think human rights cities seem to be more open to bundle human rights and the SDG agenda in some practical ways, but apparently they are still lacking practical experience on how such an integrated approach can best be implemented. Lesson 3, the SDGs are not necessarily a core component of the human rights city concept. Now, I think an all too euphoric attitude has to be put into perspective a little bit. Doing the SDGs does not necessarily mean doing human rights. I think instead, rather careful assessments have to be made in each city context, and therefore more general conclusions whether a human rights city concept should include the SDGs as a core component are not really meaningful, in my opinion. Lesson number 4, I think we should not confuse apples with pears. Now, what do I mean by that? Policymakers might sometimes be inclined to differentiate too carelessly between the 2 agendas. They might even pick and choose whatever seems best or easiest to implement. But if a human rights city really strives for such an integrated approach, I think there is a requirement to make a conscious and informed decision to follow such an integrated approach. And now, in my opinion, the main reason for that is that the monitoring and evaluation processes that are required, they differ significantly. Measuring impact and monitoring progress at the local level is, of course, important to understand the successes and failures of specific policies, but most importantly, also to hold local authorities accountable. And final lesson 5, I think there are success factors for human rights city policies that have been established that could be considered. Now, the recent research found that there are mainly 5 success factors for human rights policies at the local level. Each of these success factors, I think, raises some question in terms of human rights cities intending to pursue the SDGs concurrently. Now, success factor 1 is the personal commitment of a high-level politician. I think here we should ask ourselves, is there indeed a politician willing to commit to both human rights and the SDGs? And is this person also aware of the differences between these 2 agendas? Success factor 2 concerns the concreteness of policy objectives. Now, here we might ask, is an integrated policy still concrete enough? And is it likely to serve both human rights and the SDGs also after political negotiation processes that usually take place at the local level or are required? Success factor 3, institutionalization. How can we achieve that for an idea that is trying to implement both human rights and the SDGs? Success factor 5 concerns the duration of a measure. How can we implement human rights and SDGs by way of long-term measures or policies? And in particular, given the fact that human rights will go on after 2030, but the SDGs will be replaced by new development goals, most likely. And finally, my point is the success factor number 5, participation. How can the people who are directly concerned still participate? The target group might increase significantly if a policy pursues human rights and SDGs at the same time. So, and this is also already the point where I come to my conclusion. I think human rights cities, or persons trying to conceptualize human rights cities, I think they are well advised to think about these lessons and also to think about these questions. Otherwise, a truly integrated approach could put potentially successful human rights policies at risk. So this was my presentation. I thank you very much. Of course, please feel free to contact me or visit my organization at humanrightsgolocal.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and thank you for being on time, and thank you for leaving us with that reflection, or at least with that that idea that we need to really think through how to combine these 2 agendas in order to not water down the importance in my particular view of human rights and the importance of fulfilling the obligations that state authorities have in connection with human rights framework. So thank you for that, but questions and answers will come later on and we will discuss further your ideas.